Hello, everyone. Welcome to Analysis in Chains by CryptoNews.com, your daily source of all things crypto. This is Nathan. Today we got a special guest episode. Our good friend Frank Chen from San Francisco, recently did a live event at Draper Associates. He interviewed one of the people from Draper Associates, and we're very lucky to have them on the show. This is a recording of the live event. If you like live events, we have one coming up on the 3rd of May in Berlin. And the details will be in the notes of this, but essentially you should come. It's this week in Berlin, and we are also going to have one coming up on the 25th of May in San Francisco, and I will be there. And so, join us. It will be fun. And without further ado, here's Frank.
This is the Analysis in Chains with Nathan Williams and Neil Kieran.
Thank you for joining us today here at the first Analysis in Chains meetup. Just to give you a little background about myself, my name is Frank. I got interested in blockchain mid-2017, and in the progress of looking for more materials to learn about blockchain, I came across the podcast Analysis in Chains. I reached out to them. They have a Slack group, and I joined that and was pretty active in the community. And Nathan, the founder of the podcast, said, let's start meetups in every group, every country. And so the first meetup was in Berlin. The second meetup started in London, and then now there's a meetup here in San Francisco. Today we have with us Abhishek Punia. He likes to be called Punia, so we can just call him Mr. Punia. He is the blockchain lead at the Open Platform at Berkeley. He's also an advisor to Helix 3, which is a healthcare-based or healthcare blockchain startup. And then most notably, he is a cryptocurrency analyst at Draper Associates. So the goals of today are going to be mainly education. So none of this is going to be investment or financial advice. That's just going to be the disclaimer right there. And what we're going to ask Punia here today is how he approaches the investment space in the ICO space, understand a little bit about his investment philosophy and how he thinks when he approaches how he does in his investments. And we'll also talk a little bit at the end about how to get involved in the blockchain community. So I'd like to start off our conversation, Punia, about how you got into the cryptocurrency space. I think with any kind of industry and any kind of space, motivation is really important in terms of why a person is motivated to be in a particular space. Could you give us a little bit about your narrative and how you got into cryptocurrency?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the warm intro. My story was a bit odd. I started off in college. I came to college, I wanted to do entrepreneurship and be involved in the tech startup life. But somewhere along the way, I got pulled into the business community and thought I'd be an investment banker when I grew up. I soon realized that wasn't the most fun job. And I ended up, when interviewing, I got rejected from most places, probably for lack of culture fit, who knows. But those series of rejections kind of gave me an opportunity to reevaluate what I really wanted to do. So in that, I started exploring different technologies and different projects that are occurring in the world. And I came across blockchain when a club in Berkeley that used to be the Bitcoin Association rebranded itself as Blockchain at Berkeley. And at the time, it was a really young and optimistic club. But I went and I talked to the people and I looked at the history of the blockchain, kind of the cypherpunk movement that led up to it, and the ethos the original members wanted to follow. And it really resonated with my own principles and moral philosophies. And so with that, I kind of took faith in this budding technology at the time and decided to kind of pursue it as my future. And luckily enough, it kind of blew up, and then Blockchain at Berkeley became a huge global, probably the biggest collegiate organization. And and then I slowly ended up here.
Cool, thank you. So let's talk a little bit about your investment philosophy. So on your Medium account, Punia's Medium account is here on the board if any of you are interested in reading this stuff. You you outlined the genesis of your thoughts, where the projects that you trend towards investing in, you believe that their existence is defined by a moral obligation as opposed to a technological necessity. You believe that themes like privacy, scalability, identity, and also governance will help these projects through like any sort of market corrections. How are you using those themes to look at like your current portfolio, and how has this view colored your decisions in the investment space?
Yeah, so oftentimes you're approached with ideas and projects that seem like they might be a good fit for the blockchain. You know, there's some element or some need for distributed data structure and economic incentives. But what you kind of begin to understand is that most of those ideas, they sound good in the space of blockchain, but they kind of sound better in the space outside of blockchain. So it's this interesting dynamic that just because blockchain is kind of trending right now, that a lot of people are trying to fit it in to their kind of product thesis. But what I think blockchain accomplishes well by not having a coercive source of authority that can punish bad actors and reward good ones is that you can create ecosystems and societies where no one is in control, and where, because no one is in control, no one can then change why the society was created in the first place. And so that kind of bleeds into the reason why Bitcoin came into existence, you know. Part of it was a lashback against federal banks kind of, you know, manipulating monetary policy and wiping away value from people who work really hard in the societies to earn it, and things along that nature. And I think those solutions, while Bitcoin is clearly not as perhaps rigorous as a federal bank, especially in the United States, there exists kind of this moral seed that will be why people will continue to use it, even if it's perhaps not the most convenient or powerful solution, because they find the underlying value and reason why it exists as enough. And that's why I think that those projects that capture that core, almost human components, this appeal to human morality and those characteristics we all value, I feel those are the ones that will be able to succeed and pass a correction or something of that nature.
So do you have any kind of examples right now in your investment portfolio that you've applied this sort of thinking towards? And as a follow-up question, I'm pretty sure like that's not the only thing that you look at when you're deciding whether or not a company is a good investment. You're going to also be looking at, you know, character profiles within the company, how much of the product that they promise is actually built, what are like the technical and also feasibility limitations. Can you talk a little bit about that, and maybe if you can provide a real world example?
Sure, yeah. So a real world project that I thought was interesting that we invested in was called Gun.db, and I believe their token is Axe. And what they did is they allowed these decentralized mesh networks to occur to create kind of these local internet pockets where packets are encrypted and people are paid for connecting to people. So imagine a mesh network where it's me, Frank, and yourself, and I want to communicate with you. I would go through Frank, and Frank would be paid for connecting us two through some sort of token incentive. And what's interesting about that is the packets that are sent that he sees are all encrypted, so you're able to have net neutrality at a cryptographic level, which is quite a pertinent case, at least in our modern American society today. And so I thought that was really interesting. And that kind of makes the roles of ISPs really like intercontinental communication, where mesh networks don't quite make sense. And so I think projects like that, where they protect kind of data privacy, are fascinating. And I guess to the other things that we look towards, team is incredibly important. Like there has to be some story behind the founders of why they're doing it, especially if there's a moral reason to why they decide to do it. Like for example, in the healthcare space, you'll see people who had a dear loved one be affected by inefficiencies in medicine. And so then they'll get this genesis idea and they'll apply it to the blockchain. And that's a really strong use case. And so besides team, the other part is feasibility. A lot of people are really passionate about the blockchain space. They believe they found a really good use case. They're aligned in their core ethos, but they miss some technological limitations that are, at least today, inherent in blockchain technologies. And those limitations prevent those projects from even theoretically becoming a possibility. So those are kind of the main metrics.
So if for anyone out there who's doing a potential ICO, what would you say are red flags when you're looking at a company if they want to do a token sale or something? What would be a red flag for you to not be interested in investing?
Yeah, so for example, a lot of people will say a decentralized gig platform, and then they'll have a token, like the gig token, that be used to facilitate transactions within this gig platform. And for me, it's a bit of a red flag if that's the only use case, or that's the only utility of the token. It's kind of a weak utility, because then people will just use it to transact, and they'll sell it when they don't need it, and that will probably not perform that well. So if we're looking at it from a token investment standpoint, there probably has to be some utility besides just transacting within the chain that you want to build. A lot of the times people overestimate the power of a smart contract. Smart contracts, at least with modern scripting abilities and how computation over the blockchain is done, smart contracts can be really complex. So a lot of the times when people kind of like, instead of trying to integrate technological solutions at the protocol level, kind of like leave it to these smart contract abstractions, that's a huge risk, and it's a huge red flag for me. And I typically try to ask questions to see how much they fundamentally understand blockchain technologies, so that if they do fundamentally understand it, but they're kind of misapplying it in this one area, that's okay, because then I can help them understand it better and construct their platform a little bit better.
Cool. Okay, so let's shift over to blockchain industry in general. So the way I see it, there are generally two scenarios that can play out for blockchain technologies. One, which is more of a direct method. So what kind of problems can blockchain technologies actually solve for? And then there's the indirect method, which is what kind of blockchain opportunities can businesses take advantage of? Which means, like as an example, we have companies who are buying up land ownership rights for mining. So that's like more of an indirect method that the blockchain industry is affecting other industries. Where do you see both direct and indirect influences of blockchain on the world in the next 3 to 5 years?
Well, I think most technological revolutions and adoption cycles are fueled by direct association as opposed to indirect. When businesses come in, when large, like established corporations come in and try to make something real, they're typically slow, and they're typically not adaptive to like what it needs to be. So I'm quite bearish on companies like IBM or Cisco or whatever coming in and being the leaders in the blockchain revolution per se. So I much more strongly believe in the direct way. And the direct way also is empirically, at least in the space, what has happened. Like blockchain kind of blew up because of Bitcoin, because Satoshi had this idea of preventing centralized control of value and monetary supply. So I think that's going to be the way forward.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned Satoshi, and it's sort of like his vision of what he wanted Bitcoin to be. What do you see are some of the biggest barriers to adoption? And you can think about it in multiple ways, like one being as a medium of exchange. So there are going to be barriers to adoption for looking at blockchain technologies as a medium of exchange. You can also look at, there are barriers to adoption in scaling the technology as well. In your experience, what have you seen as the biggest barriers to adoption?
So I think when you have something that works well in the United States, like the US dollar, it's tough to get people to shift their pattern of behavior to adopt a cryptocurrency, for example. And so that's kind of been a huge barrier in the United States. Adoption in the US is mostly as a speculative asset. That's just the reality of it. But in other nations where the power of the fiat currency isn't as strong, such as South American nations or African nations or the Philippines, where Bitcoin and blockchain cryptocurrencies account for 33% of all remittance payments, then you see a lot stronger use cases. So I think in a weird way, the adoption of blockchain is kind of antipodal to the strength of the federal bank and the economy and the fiat currency. So that behavior pattern is big. The other aspect that's big is government. A lot of blockchain projects are afraid of continuing because they're afraid of getting lashed back by the government and being put into prison for presumably something that they innocently wanted to do. So far, it seems to be only China that's taken an aggressive stance against blockchain and cryptocurrencies, but the global atmosphere is still a little shaky. And so a lot of the projects that I talk to and I believe in and I work with are unfortunately not proceeding at the time being because of that regulatory uncertainty. And of course, the classical problems of adoption that occur with any technology, which is just the hardware infrastructure, even given the existence of the software. And hardware is clearly tougher to scale. And so that'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
So what you mentioned that China was like the least receptive to blockchain technologies. Can you go a little bit more into that? Just because like yesterday there was a career fair at Berkeley, the blockchain career fair, and a lot of them were Chinese companies, and like Neo is also from China. Like how does the distinction between like companies that are burgeoning and have a lot of innovation stemming from places like Shanghai coincide with that comment about how China is less receptive to blockchain?
Yeah, it's a bit of a contradiction because there are actually a lot of really good projects that come out of China. So I think the ban on ICOs happened relatively recently. I'm actually not sure what the chronology is. So essentially, they stop public ICO sales from happening. So a lot of these really young projects are public sales. A lot of them are from China, but they're headquartered elsewhere: Hong Kong, Taiwan, Caymans, all those other entities, but operate within China, which is kind of a legal gray area. It's interesting because they can't really talk about ICOs in China. You can talk about your product, but if you talk about the sale aspect of it, you risk getting your meetup shut down or whatever. So it's a bit of and it's really confusing because the current president, I'm not sure if that's the proper political term, the leader of the Communist Party said that token sales and ICOs and blockchain and cryptocurrencies are inevitable. Yet at the G20 summit, it was really only China that had a firm negative stance against it. So it's a love-hate dynamic, and it'll be fun to see how it evolves.
So I want to shift back a little bit to like Satoshi's original like thought for blockchain, which was complete like decentralization. What do you think are some of the themes and the trends to look out for as blockchain progresses as an industry together? I'm seeing like a lot of companies and ICOs coming out with extensible platforms that, like for example, the Open Platform, where it's essentially a Stripe for cryptocurrency payments. So it's a platform that sits on top of existing companies and allows for some interaction on the blockchain. People have said also that pure decentralization is also not the particular goal for blockchain. What kind of trends do you see in the industry right now?
Yeah. So I see large societal level blockchain projects such as revamping a currency. Those need to be decentralized, and they're by nature global and large scale. In regards to how applications and future software products that most people will interact with, in regards to the blockchain, we kind of hypothesize that the blockchain is similar to a kernel of an application as opposed to the entire application itself. Too many people try to put the entire application onto the blockchain, onto smart contracts, and then that's kind of where you see like executing like a CryptoKitties app costing like $80, and it's a bit of I think it's a bit of a maturity phase where everyone's enamored with it, so everyone wants to put everything on the blockchain. Whereas in the future, we'll see the blockchain as a kernel doing the things that it's very good at, such as data issuance, auditability, that kind of those tracking mechanisms. And then on top of it will be other technology stacks. Interactions between the blockchain and centralized data structures will occur. And that's kind of what we're trying to do at Open Platform and things like that. So core fundamental societal kind of institutions, when they adopt the blockchain, those will be purely decentralized and global. But in regards to the application space, the blockchain will be a kernel, technological kernel, as a part of a larger technology stack.
So I guess you're talking earlier about utility tokens as well. And I wanted to sort of ask you the question, because you mentioned like as the space matures, there's going to be different applications. And recently, there's been a big debate on whether or not an ICO is like a utility token or is it a security token, and whether or not it's a utility or security token will determine essentially its like regulatory fate in the future. How has that factored into how you look at ICOs and also how you invest?
Yeah, so these are kind of the regulatory uncertainties that exist for some reason that are preventing the adoption of blockchain technologies. From a technological perspective, utility versus security is just a word. It doesn't mean that much. When it comes to how we evaluate projects, when we see projects that try to position themselves specifically as compliance and regulatory friendly as one of their like main value adds, that's a red flag for me. So if they come in and say you should invest in us because we're really good because we're a security token, I don't buy that point at all personally. To me, utility and security tokens are just words the government's invented or people have invented to bypass government regulation and whatnot and so forth. And so I kind of see them being phased out over the long term.
Which one do you see being phased out?
I mean, again, I kind of see them as like almost synonymous in a way from a technological perspective, at least. So whatever people want to call them in the future, I guess if the government wins out, then all be security tokens. If cryptographers win out, then all be utility tokens. Or maybe people just call them tokens in general.
Okay. I guess we can move on from that topic.
Sure.
I think a lot of problems that ICOs are facing right now is that there's a lot of volatility in the cryptocurrency space. And so people have talked about, there needs to be a stable coin that can hold its value so that people can conduct transactions and do validation without having the price of one coin just shoot up overnight. How have you seen like particular ICOs deal with that kind of volatility? If they're building like on the Ethereum network, how do they deal with the volatility of Ethereum?
Yeah, well, even if you build on top of the Ethereum network, you typically have like an ERC20 whose value is held independently of the Ethereum network to some extent. It's funny because over the past year, when people talk about volatility, in 2017 it's supposed to be volatility up, and that's okay, right? Because then people don't really, and everyone wins because everyone's making money. Over the past few months, there's been volatility down, and then so suddenly you see capital dry up and projects dry up, and suddenly no more $100 million raises, more, I guess, palatable $20 million raises, which are still insane compared to what a normal tech company will raise. It's actually funny, sometimes in our partner meetings at Draper Associates, we'll be evaluating like a normal Silicon Valley company, and we'll be like fighting like, hey, is this an $8 million valuation or a $9 million valuation? How should we value it? And then the next meeting, it'll be like a token company, we're like, oh man, like $40 million, yeah, I guess that sounds kind of reasonable. And it's just kind of a crazy juxtaposition. But back to your original question. So in the past, volatility has been mostly up, so ICOs haven't suffered because most people will deploy their Ethereum because they're like, okay, Ethereum's going to go up, but perhaps this will go up even more. Even if it doesn't go up even more, it'll go up a little bit. So who cares? I'm making money. With the drying up, it's become more of an issue, and base coins have become more relevant. So Basecoin itself had a very successful ICO. I'm personally bearish on them. I think usability will lead to stability, and to solve usability, you can't solve stability and then go to usability. You have to solve usability first. And that's kind of the thesis at Open Platform as well. And so that's kind of how I see it. I don't see stability as a problem that needs to be solved at a technological level, purely. More so at a human behavioral usability level.
I'd like to go back to that little comment about what happens at Draper Associates in those meetings.
Yeah.
You want to give us a little bit of insight as much as possible about how these meetings go down and what's actually discussed?
Yeah, I mean, it's just funny, right? So at Draper Associates, there's 5 of us. Me and Tim Draper are typically the only ones handling the blockchain and cryptocurrency aspect of it. And then his son Billy and Siri handle kind of the more traditional deals. And so, I mean, nothing really changes. We just personally, like, we're cognizant of kind of the absurdity of our conversations, especially when they happen like right after each other. Typically, the industry is what it is. So if we see like a project we're really passionate about, even if it might be at an aggressive, to say the least, valuation, we'll consider it more strongly. So I don't think it affects anything from a valuation standpoint. It's just more like funny. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So for those of you out there who may or may not be accredited investors, what kind of advice can you give to not only accredited investors, but also just like normal folks who are buying coins and also altcoins through GDAX and also Binance? What kind of advice can you give them in terms of based on your investment experience?
Yeah, if you're not willing to like do deep research into a project, just like as it is with equities, you probably shouldn't invest in the ICO or the altcoin itself. And a lot of the times, it's kind of tough to do that level of deep research because there's such a large amount of information asymmetry that occurs in the space that it's kind of a Sisyphean battle to fight. So when it comes to investing, I would typically stick to the core coins. In my mind, are Bitcoin and Ethereum. When it comes to smart contract platforms, the developer community and community in general that Ethereum has built up, as well as a developer tool set that it's established, the consensus is mostly unparalleled. It's on an orbit of its own. And when it comes to cryptocurrencies that represent currencies themselves, Bitcoin is unparalleled in terms of actual usage. Monero is perhaps its closest rival because it's used in a lot of drug markets, and anonymity is important there. But I think if I was to invest, I'd just stick to those two.
Okay. So you're currently the advisor for Helix 3, which is a healthcare blockchain startup company.
Mm-hmm.
For anyone out there who might be looking for advisors for their ICOs or their own blockchain startup, what would you say about, like, for founders, what should they look for in someone who's an advisor to their possible project? And what, I guess, like, can you also outline a little bit how you would approach, a blockchain business and breaking it down and seeing what kind of questions you're going to ask them in order to understand the project a little better?
Yeah. So if you're looking for an advisor, or if an advisor approaches you and he wants like a percentage of your tokens, don't do it. That's like, I think, the clearest heuristic. Because most credible advisors most likely will not ask for too many tokens unless it's like much further down the timeline. But you do see a lot of these like blockchain evangelists and ICO advisors and whatnot claiming to have done so many token raises, and they'll charge you like a 1 to 3% fee, and that's they're probably just gonna flip your token as soon as it hits the secondaries. So I think that should be a huge red flag. As to how to approach someone, well, Helix 3 kind of they cold messaged me on LinkedIn, and they almost relentlessly kept messaging me. So I opened their deck and I read their platform, and then I talked to the guys, and they were kind of the first blockchain project that I felt like their architecture was right, in the healthcare space specifically, and that's why I agreed to get involved with them. So that's kind of how that happened. As for questions I asked, I just tried to probe how they thought about the blockchain to make sure their core fundamental understanding was on point, because everything from there can kind of be fixed and edited as an advisor.
Cool, thank you. What kind of resources or advice would you give individuals who want to learn more about blockchain? And like, this could span anything from podcasts you listen to, books you've read, Medium posts you've written or read as well.
Yeah, so I think a really good way is just to read white papers and to read how people have analyzed those white papers. People that you deem are credible. I think that helps you kind of form your own mental heuristics to then evaluate projects on your own. But there's no real learning that can be as fruitful as like actually talking to people in the space. The only issue to that is that there's asymmetry in access to information. So the way to do that then is to just like attend meetups like these aggressively, conferences like them, like the ones that pop up all the time, especially in Silicon Valley, aggressively. And it's interesting because once you're like onboarded, when you've spent like kind of your time in learning the space, you before you know it, you're kind of the expert in your room, and then you're the one people try to talk to. But it's mostly getting past that level of asymmetry. I think blockchain at Berkeley, which is a club on campus that I'm involved in at Berkeley, They do a really good job because they've posted all their blockchain fundamentals courses, which approaches blockchain from a mix of business and technological lens. They posted all those lectures online, and they've also posted the blockchain developer course, which is more from a developer standpoint online as well. Kind of the point where most people start their journey in this space is this like infamous Princeton Bitcoin book, and I believe they have either a Coursera or Udacity course on it online as well. And I think that's a really phenomenal course. It teaches you a lot of the base history behind the blockchain as well as its core technological components. And if you get through that course, I think you're positioned well.
I think also I'll add mention to Andreas Anatopoulos' book, Mastering Bitcoin. Taught me a lot about how it works under the hood. He also has a book coming out called Mastering Ethereum. And so that will give you a look into smart contracts as well. So we're going to move to the Q&A soon. So this way you can throw all the questions you want at Mr. Punia here. Before we do that, is there anything else that you'd like to share about your experience at Draper Associates, ICOs, to the moon?
Yeah, so advice a partner at Draper Associates gave me is he firmly believes that blockchain will be bigger than most things that have happened so far. But the problem that people have to get past is that once it does crash, so to make sure you stay in the space and make sure you're able to survive that bear cycle. And he kind of talked to me about the internet days, where everyone was involved in the internet before like the 2000 crash. And then after the crash, a lot of those early people were like, all right, this internet thing's not that great. It was a fad. It's had its heyday. Websites are about as far as it's going to go. And then they totally missed out on the mobile revolution, e-commerce, shared economy, and all of that. So I think that's a piece of advice he gave me, and I think that will hopefully hold true.
Cool, thank you. All right, so we're going to move to the Q&A. I'm going to walk around the microphone, and if anyone has questions for Punia, please raise your hand. I'm coming over.
I know you said you're bearish on basis in the coin, but don't you think that stability is more important for the wider adoption of the cryptocurrencies?
Yeah, I do think stability is important. I don't think stability is the most important. I think there are a lot of other obstacles to mainstream adoption, and once those adoptions are solved, then stability will naturally come without it needing to be baked into the actual protocol of the coin. So I think tackling scalability is an easy software level problem, which is why it's so attractive, and it ignores the other hardware user behavior aspects of mainstream adoption that people often ignore in our hardware problems. And so that's kind of why I think stability is important. I just don't think a stable token is important.
Thank you. Can I ask one?
Yeah, sure. Of course.
At Draper Associates, you have an online application. When people submit, you call them to the office to do pitches, or how that works?
Oh yeah, we'll typically read through your pitch and then you'll get back to you on either a phone call with me or ways you could improve or things like that. So yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Right behind you.
So just building upon the last question, if stablecoin is not the way to get stability, even as a model, then how do we get stability in, pick 3 of the top coins, and whatever you think is a model that might get us in?
Yeah, I think you have to really, especially for adoption in Western nations where currencies are not really a thing people stress about. What you need to ensure is that you mimic the user experience people have in paying with fiat or interacting with fiat currencies with cryptocurrencies as well. And so that extends not only to how you pay for things, but also how the trust that you have in that payment. The issue is when you use Visa or credit cards, if there is a fraudulent transaction, you can ask for a chargeback. Presently, you can't really do that with Bitcoin. And so solving those kind of luxuries almost that we're used to are going to be critical in mainstream adoption for things like cryptocurrencies in the Western world. In kind of the developing nations where the faith in fiat isn't as strong, there are less hurdles to cross, and those hurdles have already been crossed. I mentioned the Philippines with their 30% remittances in crypto and things like that, and I believe it was Argentina doing their own ICO with the Petro, and so they use that to, I think, bypass trade agreements. Venezuela, apologies, yeah, to kind of bypass embargoes and trade agreements. So I thought it's kind of funny and interesting, but I do think it's mostly from mimicking the experience people have with fiat payments.
Do you know who our president is?
Our president? Trump? Yeah.
Because you said we're good.
Oh, yeah.
We disagree.
Hey, I have two questions for you.
Uh-huh.
So since the past couple of months, have you kind of changed the way you evaluate ICOs in terms of like the past, I don't know, 8 months before we went through the cycle? And also like, since you're at the venture capital firm, have you kind of gotten more questions regarding kind of this bear cycle and how you kind of handle those interactions with people that are kind of giving you money?
Yeah, I think the bear cycle actually kind of reconfirmed my thesis as opposed to being opposed to it. Because before then I saw these projects where I didn't believe in, I didn't want to invest in. Yet they're raising so much money, I'm like, shit, am I like looking at this the wrong way? But then with the bear cycle coming along, that didn't happen as much. And so the companies that were succeeding were ones that I felt like I believed in. And so it was kind of more of a confirmation of my investment thesis. As far as like how we look at this bear cycle, Tim is funny, like he feels comforted by it, that the value of Bitcoin is going down and getting corrected. And that's actually an opinion I've heard from a lot of people. A lot of people felt comfortable by this bear cycle. They felt like that was natural and it needed to happen. And they kind of restored their faith in the markets as somewhat rational, perhaps not completely so. But yeah, so kind of oxymoronically, a lot of people viewed the bear cycle as a good thing.
If you look at the sharing economy, that didn't really emerge till mobile was a little bit more mature. So if we apply the same analogy to blockchain, do you think that blockchain companies will really emerge after the infrastructure is already built? Because a lot of infrastructure is still immature right now.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of the software and protocol level stuff has been developed. What has yet to be developed is kind of the interaction point between the individual and the technology. And popularly, that interaction point is the wallet. And so wallet software and how people kind of think about the wallet, be it hardware, software, cold or hot storage, making that experience usable is, I think, the biggest, is I think the barrier that you're referring to.
Right. Well, what I was referring to is the more blockchain infrastructure. So, because if you want to build an application on blockchain, right, like Ethereum is CryptoMove with at times it would cost $80 to $100 for a transaction. That's the implementation of the blockchain, right? So what I'm saying is, if you look at AWS, you have S3, you have all these infrastructure that's already built, and it's very easy to build a web company on AWS, right? So if we want to build smart contracts or applications on top of the existing blockchain, it's not really that mature yet, right? So do you think that first it would require all these companies to be become more mature, and then we'll see real applications?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no in a way. Like with your example of CryptoKitties, I think that's mostly a fault in how people are architecturally approaching the blockchain. Like CryptoKitties is a great example where they just put all their code on chain, and then things like high execution prices were an issue. Whereas I see more so the future of these blockchain projects, they have a lot of their core computation occur off chain, and they only have on chain what the blockchain is good for, which is asset issuance, payments, tracking, and things like that. But you're also right in a way. Like if you look at Bitcoin, before the Lightning Network was implemented, it was really expensive. Like each transaction was like $30. But then what was fascinating is once the Lightning Network got implemented, you saw just transaction fees just plummet. And once if you saw like a graph, the topology of Lightning nodes, it was like day by day just blooming. And I remember one of the partners at my firms commented that it was almost like seeing the birth of the internet back in those days. So yes and no. So some of the reasons why they're not quite ready for applications is because the protocol is not ready, but also because the architectural approach developers take has not quite been improved yet.
So one of the things that crypto, most investors always talk about is the fact that, Bitcoin or cryptocurrency is not a fiat currency. I'm just wondering why your thoughts of people so focused on this, because, even back when the US dollar was on the gold standard, people are like, oh, we didn't have inflation. Look at the 1930s, right? There was a ton of inflation there. And so I feel like a lot of it's built on this myth that, cryptocurrency is not a fiat currency, which, people are creating them out of thin air. And a lot of these people have a lot less credibility than even the worst third world governments, right? So, those people at least have land and control. I'm not saying, they're a good thing, but why is this, why is this obsession? Why do you think there is this obsession in the community of this sort of imaginary finiteness for some sense, right?
I'm sorry, I might have misunderstood your question. Is your question?
People always say, there's a finite number of Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Why is that important? And why does that even matter?
Oh yeah, so I think with Bitcoin specifically, it was just to introduce scarcity to bring about value. So I think that was mostly like an economic point. But I think that perspective is also especially espoused in Western developed nations. That kind of narrative, I would wager, is not as popular in developing and economically more unstable nations where they have experienced flaws with fiat currencies as a whole. I hope that answered your question. I hope I didn't miss it.
Yeah. I was just wondering why the community is so, obsessed with this, whereas, in reality, it's mostly a myth because people can create thousands of cryptocurrencies. I mean, there's hundreds of them or thousands of them at this point, right?
Oh yeah, most definitely.
So it just seems, find it odd when you talk to people and I ask them, why is Bitcoin, why is it better than money? They say it's decentralized. I'm like, okay, what does that mean? And usually they go blank, and then it's not a fiat currency. Okay, why does that matter? They also go blank, right? So I'm just wondering, from your standpoint, does this even matter? Is this even relevant? And
Yeah, I mean, okay. So to answer your question, and that was helpful. I think the two questions you asked, the fiat versus decentralized, are kind of linked.
Right.
Because the same thing, right? Because it's decentralized is why it's not fiat. And I think that's important because almost from a moral perspective, you'd want the value that you get for the work you do to be contained in a value of transfer that's independent from the actions of a central body. So I think from kind of like this moral, perhaps more so philosophical as opposed to moral perspective, decentralized is important and non-fiat nature is important for currency as a whole.
Yeah, but I mean, with you have a transaction with Visa knows where you bought it, right? You have a transaction on the blockchain, everyone knows what you've done. Do you really want all your purchases available to everyone? Right? That includes these people that you're trying to supposedly protect your data from, right?
Totally, yeah.
So I find this, this sort of concept of decentralization will bring this sort of democratization of pick anyone's favorite topic and find the according ICO or whatever, right? That sort of just like you're not hiding information, you're actually making it available to everyone, which is contrary to what most people's perception of how this works. They assume anonymity about it, but the anonymity is only that you can create an imaginary address, but once you link the address to the person, you now know their entire previous history, right?
Yeah, totally. So Bitcoin at best has pseudo-anonymity.
Right.
It is the public address. Although there are a lot of really interesting protocols to implement total anonymity. The most promising of which is this protocol called Mimblewimble that was almost romantically, like Bitcoin, published anonymously on a forum. And a French mathematician took it and turned it into something more tangible. And we see the first implementation of it as Grim. So privacy is a huge point, and it's probably being worked on, definitely. Yeah.
Anybody else have questions?
I have a dumb question. What's going to happen to mining? At some point, though, it's not going to worth your while to mine.
Yeah, so that's like the market, Once it's not worth your while, you'll do something else that would give you profits, and then once it is, it'll come back to it. A common criticism of mining is that it uses an excessive amount of energy. And I think that's kind of funny because you look at the amount of resources and energy used to preserve fiat systems, and the amount of, cotton grown to make the US dollar, the gas.
Most of the US dollar is electronic, though. Most of it's not actually in paper money, right?
Perhaps, and you could look at the banking institution, or just like the energy and resources that are used to maintain the US dollar as a whole. Perhaps it isn't the paper itself. But I think once you look at the amount of energy used to maintain fiat systems as opposed to Bitcoin systems with proof of work, the proof of work argument by itself becomes less substantive. And also looking forward to the future, you have other potential protocol implementations like proof of stake or things like that, which perhaps might be the future.
So I just want to know the view at Draper Associates about, there are definitely limitations of Bitcoin, right? Privacy is one, using so much power for mining is another one, speed is another one. So, and there are different cryptos out there solving different problems, but no one crypto solves all the problems. At the same time, Bitcoin is the king. You ask anybody who would know about Bitcoin, he might not know about anything else. So what's the view in your firm about whether Bitcoin engineers are going to eventually solve those problems, make it private, make it more energy efficient, or is it that there are going to be different cryptos for different use cases?
Yes, that's an interesting question. So to talk about your first part of your question, it's quite topical because I actually asked Tim about this recently. And Tim's answer kind of was that, okay, in the early internet days, right, you had the HTTP protocol come out, and then several protocols followed it claiming to be faster, more private, or more secure, more scalable, or whatever. Yet the HTTP was what ended up working out and became the foundation of our modern internet. And so Tim kind of views Bitcoin as something similar, and I kind of like see value in his analogy. Whichever one is able to capture the most amount of supports, specifically I guess developer support in this case, will then be able to overcome hurdles that come after, such as privacy. Bitcoin's main hurdle was transaction costs, and that was solved by the Lightning Network, and now it's going from like $30 to like 30 cents to like send a transaction. So I think it's really cool. But quite a popular research topic in this space is whether or not you'll see like this internet of blockchains where each blockchain represents like a industry vertical or a use case or something like that, or there'll be like one big main public chain, or perhaps 2 or 3 main public chains upon which other applications will be built on top of. And nobody really has a clear answer to that yet. It's on the minds of all of us here, though.
And I have a follow-on question. Do you really see Hashgraph as a threat to blockchain?
Hashgraph is weird because they've patented it, and so no one can really use it. So I think they've kind of shot themselves in the foot if it was to ever be kind of the next generation of blockchain technologies. So I don't think Hashgraph in its current form will be a threat per se, but perhaps in the future, perhaps Hashgraph or other data structures like directed acyclical graphs, which claim to have more scalability, would be threats. I'm uncertain. So far, I'm more bullish on Bitcoin, though.
Something similar to his question. I wanted to see what you think about Tangle versus blockchain.
Yeah, so that's the directed acyclical graph. So that model kind of faces some issues in terms of block ordering. So essentially, it still has some technological problems. Like Bitcoin does too, but more core fundamental technological problems that it has to overcome before it can become competitive with Bitcoin. The most popular implementation of it so far was IOTA, and then IOTA kind of went down the sink from a technological perspective. In my opinion, I'm not like I'm measured on how I think about other data archetypes. I feel like what will happen, as it's happened with Bitcoin, is the blockchain will be preserved and other off-chain auxiliary solutions will be created to tackle issues such as scalability. Like the Lightning Network is an off-chain solution to scalability in the Bitcoin network. And so I think that's the way it'll go, as opposed to these new models winning out over the kind of linked list model.
Thank you.
So one of the most popular metrics we like to look at is transactions per second. So I guess 2 questions is, do you think this is that important? After that, what other kinds of metrics we like to look at?
Yeah. So I guess it depends on the use case, whether or not TPS is important. With something like Bitcoin, it's incredibly important, which is why like when the network kind of began to get flooded and the transaction per second limit was approached, transaction costs skyrocketed. So I think it's important. What I don't what I don't like to see is oftentimes people will take a blockchain, and in order to have higher level of throughput and scalability, they'll sacrifice stuff like privacy, security, and things like that. Now, I don't think that sacrifice, and decentralization is popular as well. And so I don't think those sacrifices are worth it. So why do you think TPS is important? I don't think it's the end all be all. And typically when projects sacrifice it in order to typically when projects sacrifice things like decentralization and privacy and security in order to achieve a high throughput, I view that as a red flag almost.
And the second question was, what are the other kinds of metrics you like to look at?
Yeah, so what's important is security as well, because the issue is once you have like a protocol issued, it's very tough to change it because there is no centralized authority to make the changes. So essentially the network has to come to a consensus. Most popularly, this is done through a fork somehow, but other projects are exploring other governance mechanisms, such as Thesis, which is one of the Draper Associates portfolio company. So I think that's the biggest issue. To be honest, I don't think too much about those kind of numerical metrics as much as I do about kind of the underlying project ethos. A lot of companies in the blockchain space raise their entire round by having a research team and writing a good white paper. Whereas if you're from kind of the traditional Silicon Valley area, especially Tim, who's been in it for a while, you kind of understand that implementations change and are adaptive, or should be and can be adaptive. So that's kind of how I look at that. If that answers your question.
So my question, I have two questions. Those are from the investing perspective. So, what do you think about the common area, different area between like venture capital in cryptocurrency and traditional typical venture capital? And the second question is that when you're investing in cryptocurrencies, what is your recommendation when considering some key risk factors? Like, how do you actually control the risk when investing in cryptocurrency?
Yeah, so it's a good question. At Draper Associates, we kind of almost try to abstract away that question. We'll treat our token investments, if and when we make them, as equity investments, even though they're not. So what that means is that we'll still typically tend to hold on for 5 to 7 years, even though with tokens you achieve liquidity potentially in a few months. So that's interesting. I guess from a purely valuations perspective, valuations in the industry are sky high. And so that kind of mucks up how you think about these companies as opposed to how you think about other companies, which is a challenge that VCs will probably have to overcome when investing in this space. But from a purely functional perspective, we try to abstract it away. From the valuation perspective, we hope this is a market bull run. Eventually, it'll kind of like reason its way back to reflect how equity companies raise and things like that.
So my question is, in your investment firm, there seems to be a concentrated pushback against Bitcoin from mainstream, world governments or established companies. Is there any talk of like what future, like in the next 12 months, what more pushback can come? Because there's also market manipulation. Anything that you guys have noticed, or what more do you see coming?
Yeah, so it seems like as far as regulatory bodies go, the G20 summit happened about a month or so ago, or a few weeks ago, and the result was mostly neutral, if not positive, for cryptocurrencies, such as Bitcoin, outside of China. So over the next 12 months, I hope we're going to see the U.S. being more reactive as opposed to proactive in terms of regulation. Like we saw several acquisitions happen in this space. We saw the company Circle buy the exchange Poloniex and have it, I think it was approved by either the SEC or some regulatory body in that kind of area. So we'll see. We hope the U.S. doesn't shoot itself in the foot and kind of miss out on this new kind of technology class. But it's tough to say as to what specifically is going to happen.
Maybe time for one or two more questions if anyone has them.
I think a couple months ago, I think Japan somehow lost
cryptocurrency theft. Could you tell what do you mean by what kind of theft is this all about?
Yeah, so it's interesting when people talk about theft because actually just recently a very popular Bitcoin influencer by the name of Ian Valina claimed to have all his crypto stolen right before tax season. So it's that's kind of convenient, right? So it's tough to see how people think about theft. The issue with Bitcoin and cryptocurrency specifically, especially at this institutional level, is key management. So essentially, like the ownership of a Bitcoin is associated to a key at a certain time, and if you lose access to the public and private key, like there's no way you can get it back. Like there's no centralized body that can like refund you the transaction like you can in Visa or with Bank of America or something like that. And so a lot of the people when they lose money, it's because their funds have been locked up in some manner, such as losing the public private key. What happened in Ethereum was there was a wallet software called Parity that was compromised, and everyone that was using a Parity multi-signature wallet lost access to all their funds at a purely just basic technological level. And so that's, I guess, also one of the kind of barriers to adaptability is like, how do you think about that? Like, it's not, so the death of Bitcoin, of Ethereum at least, almost occurred when the DAO was hacked in a way. Basically, people use the latency in the blockchain network to attack it and to keep withdrawing money because the network didn't register that they'd already withdrawn the money. And so they were able to take like $50 million worth. And that almost, at that time, $50 million was a huge part of the Ethereum total market cap. So that almost killed the currency. So what they had to do is they had to have a fork in Ethereum where they pretended like that didn't happen. And that also brings...
How did they decide on that fork if it's decentralized?
Yeah, so it's mostly so at that time the community was small. So a lot of people kind of followed the leadership of the Ethereum Foundation, or I'm not sure that's it, but the Ethereum kind of leadership that's composed of Vitalik and whatnot. But that was really, really contentious. So what happened was like another chain called Ethereum Classic continued to exist where they acknowledged the existence of the DAO hack. And both are live right now. So that's really interesting.
Isn't that essentially the government creating its own money?
A bit. So, to your point, it has been like a very large point of criticism against Ethereum and Vitalik as a whole. A lot of people believe that they should have. A lot of people believe that the hacker who stole the money should be allowed to sue the Ethereum Foundation because he didn't do anything illegal, right? Like there's a technological loophole, like your fault for leaving there. So a lot of people think that he should be able to sue and get his money back and be able to use it in whatever nature. But no, it is a common criticism. It's justified as something that had to be done, a necessary evil. So bring about the adoption.
2008.
No, exactly. Yeah, I honestly don't have too good of a kind of to kind of support their actions, but yeah, we'll see. It's kind of spurred more thought around governance for sure.
Okay, so that will conclude our Q&A. Sorry guys for the additional questions, but hopefully Punia will be sticking around for a little bit, so you guys can also mingle, meet some new people. Punia, thank you for coming out, sharing your thoughts. And that concludes the Q&A portion of the meetup.